You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Chris Garabedian, and my co-hosts today are Daphne Zohar, Sam Fazeli, Tess Cameron, Paul Matisse, and Tim Oppler. Um, Again, thank you for joining in. Let's start with kind of general sentiment. Sam and I were just chatting with this a little bit, but Tim, I mean, your reports are always a must read every week, and you follow this stuff closely. And I did note that you spoke to Brad on Biotech TV at Bio, and decidedly upbeat, especially around the M&A, but would love to hear you kick off with kind of the general sentiment over the last 2 weeks since Biotech Hangout met last.
Yeah, so the XBI is down for the year, but up massively since Liberation Day. So it's all a matter of perspective. So if you were to back up the clock to April the 8th, the famous Liberation Day, sentiment after that was just completely disastrous. And I would say today's sentiment is mixed to positive. And specifically, what you'll see is it depends very much on the fund. In my last weekly report, I likened it to the old Star Trek episodes where Captain Kirk would like land on a different planet every week. And, sometimes the planets were good and sometimes they weren't. So we're seeing the same thing with investors. Tess and I attended an event this week hosted by Royalty Pharma, which was awesome, by the way. And there were several investor panels, and Tess was quite interesting to see the differences in sentiment. So like one investor was like super negative, and then others were more positive. And it depended very much, I think, on the type of investor and how they saw the world. So I would say overall sentiment has improved, and specifically, what's I think very important right now is that both IPOs and follow-ons are performing well. So earlier in the year, those were not doing well at all. Since Liberation Day, the average IPO stock that went out earlier this year is up like 50, 60%, and follow-ons are also performing quite well. The other thing that's really weird right now is that China biotech is just killing it. So, like last month, China biotech was up almost 40%. And so, whatever we don't have, they've got right now. And, if you talk about sentiment, you kind of have to mention China as well.
Hey, Tim, I'm just curious for the decidedly bearish view from the Royalty Pharma meeting. Was that a public investor or a private investor?
It was from Samsara. So Samsara,
Yep,
Srini Akkaraju is does both privates and publics,
got it.
and so he's obviously experiencing the challenges facing a private VC right now, which is it's really hard to raise money as a private VC right now. Like you can have a company that discovered like the lost Dutchman gold mine under your headquarters, and you still like struggle to get money raised. It's just very tough for the privates, and then the publics. He's obviously experienced the full brunt of Liberation Day, so you can imagine his sentiment was different. We also heard from like Rajiv Kaul at Fidelity. We heard from Rebecca Sykes at Wellington, and they were much more positive, and that's because they have a funding base that can kind of ride through the ups and downs. But I wouldn't describe them as rosy either. I mean, it was they were optimistic, very much optimistic about what they heard at ADA,
Yeah,
and that was very exciting.
yeah. My interpretation is obviously the public markets will lead us out of this ultimately and make the VCs feel more comfortable that they can get to some exits. But when a lot of VCs, let's just throw a number out, they might be sitting on 15, 20 private investments. They definitely know that they're not going to make all those public. And so I think that's where the pain is being felt more on the private venture side, just because there's so much that is hard to get to a liquidity event or an exit in this current environment. And then on the China trade, I'm just curious, do you see it almost like an inverse correlate to like things look really bad with US and we got to get our ducks in a row? And so the feeling that, this is an advantage or an opportunity for China to fill the gap, is that part of this?
It shouldn't be. I mean, in theory, we should all kind of go up and down at the same time with the industry. I mean, what's happening in China is they don't have Trump, right? So they don't have that source of uncertainty. They don't have high interest rates. So all the things that have kind of impacted our sector have not impacted China. And then they have the wonderful tailwind of big pharma starting to buy into China. And we just keep hearing more and more rumors of like these $500 million plus deals coming for China. So we're going to see more of those coming in the weeks and months ahead. And so the Chinese investors know that because they all talk to each other using this thing called WeChat. And so that the markets are just very, very excited in China right now.
Yeah.
Hey, Tim, can I just jump in on that? There's a couple of other things I'd add to, sorry, Chris, to
Yeah,
Tim's
please,
comments.
Sam.
There's the Chinese government is supportive of biotech. That's I think that was embedded in what Tim said. But there's one other element too. In the US, one of the biggest drivers of S&P 500 massive performance is the Mag 7. And they have been on a tear. I mean, NVIDIA is knocking on $4 trillion market cap, right? And that's not really available to this extent in China. They have AI companies, there's lots of tech, but it's not the same. And biotech is in a younger place in terms of its position. It's not a 40-year sector. So I think those are also considerations that help, especially when they keep pumping out the drugs, as Tim says, sell off for $500 million upfront.
Yeah, that's great. We haven't met for 2 weeks as Biotech Hangout, and 1 week of that was bio, and I'm going to have Daphne talk to that. Daphne, anything else to comment on the market sentiments or China?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with China and then I'll talk about bio. So I think Chinese biotech is a huge problem for small and mid-sized biotechs in the US because a company can be working on a novel target, spending years and money to advance it, and then in China they can quickly move a copycat asset forward, and then you see, as they noted, Tim and Sam, a big pharma company paying a fraction to buy that asset or company compared to what they would pay in the US. And that trend is now also impacting startups with VCs going to China to buy assets. I heard that Umar Rafat is taking a bunch of public investors to China on a tour. And what I heard in particular from a number of public biotech CEOs that this is one of the biggest problems they're facing because investors are applying a huge discount in areas where the China threat is real. And one aspect of that is big pharma companies and investors, I think, need to consider carefully how the excitement around China and Chinese assets and the speed of development intersects with the current administration's messaging around policy priorities, the America First, and negative sentiment towards China. So I understand there are a number of proposals being discussed, including incentives for doing deals with US biotechs and also penalties for advancing China assets. And one quote I heard was, all those pharma companies doing deals with China are going to drop those assets like hot potatoes soon. So I do think, I don't know, how much weight I'd put into that one quote, but I do think we need to recognize there's some hype here, and in the meantime, a smart investor or pharma deal maker should view the opportunity with a balanced lens. So, in terms of bio was in Boston this week, and was, as usual, a very big conference. There was around 22,000 participants, around 50% actually, notably being international, with 70 countries represented, and lots of partnering meetings. The vibe was mixed. The capital drought, which was mentioned here, both private and public, being a major overhang, and everyone navigating the uncertainty and looming threats that have weighed down the sector. So, threats like most favored nation or MFN pricing, tariffs, China, and a need for clarity and consistency from FDA. On the positive side, there are some opportunities as the new administration takes shape. So they have their stated priorities being increased speed to market, removing red tape, excitement around cell and gene therapy, and AI in drug development. So I know there's some big and justified concerns regarding vaccine policy, but from a small and mid-sized biotech perspective, the administration has put out some, I think, very encouraging messages. So RFK posted on X that MAHA also includes MABA, or Make American Biotech Accelerate. He particularly called out that we need to stop giving an edge to foreign interests and large incumbents, which I read as negative for China assets and big pharma. And then FDA Commissioner McCary announced this new national priority voucher, which sounds intriguing and is a nice testament to the FDA's commitment to moving medicines through regulatory review more quickly, but we need to better understand the criteria, considerations, and process for granting and using the vouchers. And then I am on the board of BIO, and I see several people in the audience that are also on the board of BIO. So, from a bio perspective, in addition to pushing back on threats like MFN and tariffs, bio has been working on a few priorities in this one big beautiful bill, including R&D immediate tax deduction. So that would allow for the immediate deduction of R&D costs. I don't know how many of you have been following this, but over the past few years, companies couldn't deduct R&D in one swoop. Rather, it had to be amortized. So you get a ridiculous situation where, for example, you get partnering income for R&D, and that could be taxable if you can't deduct the expense that year. BIO also continues to push for reauthorization of the SBIR program, which Congress needs to reauthorize by the end of September. And then additional top priorities include educating administration and Congress on the negative impacts of tariffs and MFN. Industry is going to be watching closely to see if there's an MFN amendment in the reconciliation bill. And lastly, BIO has been encouraging Congress to pass the pediatric review voucher reauthorization, and this program costs taxpayers nothing and has significant bipartisan support. We also hope that the Orphan Cures Act will stay in the bill. It would allow for additional indications of an orphan rare only drug. And we heard that that might be at risk of being removed. So push to let people, let their congressmen know that that's important.
That's great, Daphne. Now, also, as the week of bio, right? McCary also was part of the listening tour in Boston. I know these were somewhat closed meetings and very structured. And actually, I had a colleague who attended the Washington, D.C. at DIA and heard comments, and she came away with a positive take, generally speaking. But any comments on the listening tour? And then we'll go to Paul for kind of a specific action that was perceived that McCary made on CalVista. But any just general comments on just summarizing the listening kind of sessions that took place?
Yeah. So I had a chance to meet both McCary and Prasad, who came across to me as earnest, very well informed, motivated to work with industry. The in-person Prasad, I think, is very different from the one some of us have gotten to know on social media. I think an outsider perspective has some benefits. There were over 100 CEOs in attendance. We each had a minute on the clock to make comments in the general session. And some of the key themes, which I think we heard back from FDA that they're very interested in, are desire for regulatory reform, focus on speed and efficiency. They want to address cultural and structural issues at FDA, like removing silos and hierarchies, transparency and flexibility, which some of this is going to speak to the next point, I guess. Surrogate endpoints and real world data, and maintaining US leadership in biomedicine. I'll give you one example that is like a flavor for the tactical ideas that they seem interested in implementing. They're calling it a one card or two card system, where each sponsor has a card they can use to request an immediate response or clarification during the FDA interaction. So this is to address the lack of clarity sponsors sometimes experience and the long, cumbersome, and bureaucratic process to get answers while companies burning cash. So that was, I thought, a really interesting example, but there's a lot more that was discussed.
Great. Paul, obviously in the news, McCary, everybody on the concern side is the politicization of decisions around coming out of FDA and influence from the commissioner and his appointees. So you want to comment on what's going on with CalVista and the controversy there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. So, yeah, I mean, I think just in general, just to bridge up the investor sentiment conversation, I mean, I think, the market is telling this story too. I think investors more or less have become a lot more comfortable with FDA risks to the sector outside of the vaccine space, of course. If we just think about the past few months and a lot of the public commentary from McCary and Prasad that, especially in like the rare disease space and the gene therapy space, that, sounds kind of more like Peter Marks than not, right? So I think in general, like the perception is mostly good, with the caveat that I think investors are watching a number of the upcoming decisions in rare and certain decisions that center around flexibility to try to figure out the true direction and where this FDA stands on the spectrum. The really odd piece of news, though, and I know we're going to talk about Capricor as well, and I think that there's some thematic overlap there, even though it's a really different situation. But the interesting news that came out this week from Endpoints, who had multiple sources in this reporting, described a situation where KalVista, who's developing an oral drug for acute treatment in hereditary angioedema, KalVista came out a few weeks ago and said that the FDA had notified them that they're not going to meet their PDUFA goal date because of resource constraints. And this was what the language that KalVista used in their press release. And KalVista is a microcap company, so they have to say something, right? From just a materiality perspective. And I think the interpretation by myself and most investors was that that product is still very likely to get approved. The data really aren't that controversial. There's a lot of drugs approved for this indication that sort of give us analogs. And they had said that they were pretty deep in labeling discussions. So it was a surprise this past week when Endpoints reported that that Macquarie had essentially told the review team to issue KalVista a CRL. And the initial reporting was a little bit like inferential because it was I think citing folks at the FDA who did not directly hear that this order came from Macquarie, but said that they knew that it did. And now there's actually an updated piece that came out this morning with more reporting on this topic. And so, I mean, look, I think it's an interesting situation. I think from a practical perspective for KalVista, I cover the stock. We still think that drug is very likely to get approved. And I think if there actually truly was any sort of political impetus to give it a CRL, I think that that's probably even less likely now that that's been reported. I think the question is really, why would this happen? If this did happen, was this because that the commissioner felt like it would be better to give this a CRL than, have a delay, and what the optics of that are? It's really hard to speculate. But I think, back to what you were saying, Chris, and, we'll talk about the Capricor situation as well. I mean, it does raise the concern around politics at the FDA, right? And I think, when I talk to investors about, a certain basket of biotech companies that have these very favorable FDA agreements, some of which they attained with the prior FDA and then may or may not have reaffirmed with this new FDA. I mean, I think everyone sort of has heard on the listening tour what Macquarie and Prasad have been saying, and it all sounds great. But there still is a little bit of an unease as we head into maybe, a year and a half of a bunch of important regulatory reviews and PDUFAs, just as it relates to, again, we've heard what they've said. They've said all the right things. They sound like they're a partner to industry and innovation. But where do they stand on the spectrum, right? Because ultimately, a lot of the reviews that are upcoming are subjective. Flexibility is subjective, right? And so, the KalVista thing is in its own bucket because I don't really think that doesn't feel, unless there's something we don't know, it doesn't feel like it's really about the merits of the product. And it sounds like this issue is passed, but for sort of guessing again, this agency and how they'll behave, I mean, it's a topic that comes up in a lot of my investor discussions still.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll just comment a little bit on this. And again, I'm always a little skeptical with anonymous sources and kind of inferential data without the company and what they can formally communicate or what the FDA is formally communicating. But I'm also you know a little sympathetic to McCary in that I've been part of post-merger integrations when you acquire a company, inheriting a lot of new people. At Sarepta, when I took over the CEO role, there was a decades old management team. Many of them were not the right fit, and we needed to replace some of them. And when you're coming in new with a different kind of framework, okay, the first thing you want to do as a leader, and I think most CEOs can relate to this, is that, all right, do I have people who are aligned with this vision? And it's not going to be implemented tomorrow, but like over the years, right? Am I going to be? And you're going to see displacement. You're going to see people quit and leave and disgruntled. And I just, I always think about what if the tables were turned? Let's say 4 years, the new administration comes in, the same people that are booing and jeering, against every action and every departure, right? They're going to be cheering and saying this is amazing and this is great that we're getting rid of all of these people. So I think, it's expected that a leader needs a team that he can rely on. And then I also think about like the KalVista, maybe the Capricor, like I think he should delegate to the people he's put in place, like Vinay, et cetera, and not, be visible as commissioner, right, to get involved in these. But you have to believe he's going to get the criticism for any misstep. For I mean, the microscope is on, right? The spotlight's on, and so I'd imagine that he wants to be a little leaning in to almost every key decision, because if he just kind of lets it just play out, then he's going to be the one as new commissioner that's going to get the criticism. So I would expect that a little bit more intervention to just figure out, now that it's on his watch, right? What is he going to see? And then the last thing is, there's been a long-standing, decades-long, battle between the divisions and the hierarchy, right? The hierarchy policy doesn't always align with the divisions or specific divisions, and that's got to play out. Like, we got to figure out what this looks like. And so again, direct intervention is not common, but I think in this period and stage that that the new administration, the political appointees are trying to work out, how is the new administration going to operate as an FDA? I would expect a little bit of this uncertainty, and how's it going to work out division by division. So that's my perspective on this, and why I always feel like we should all, if we could go to sleep for 6 months or 9 months and wake up and see how things are operating, is probably the
Chris,
better. Yeah.
Chris, do you think it's like believable that an FDA commissioner would actually, in effect, order a CRL because that's better than the optics of a delay? I mean, it feels like that has been what's inferred here without really
Right.
saying it. And again, I think, like, kind of what you're alluding to, and I'm trying to think out loud about, is like, does it actually like pass the smell test? But if it is true, I mean, that's
Yeah.
certainly disconcerting. Like, how do you make sense of
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
having been
So
someone
no,
who's worked with
I
the
don't
idea?
think it should be a unilateral kind of, flying in, right? Helicoptering in and saying this is what my guess is, and this is just from personal experience. He's getting a lot of information, right? And we don't know who's bending his ear. And it could be that somebody's raising an alarm and they may be misguided, right? But I would expect that if he's got an internal dispute, and people are, and if they want to listen, it sounds like they want to hear everything and make the right decisions, that he's probably hearing countervailing views that he's got to consider. And he's hearing what, the division leader or the clinical reviewer is saying, or the CMC right reviewer. And I think that he's trying to potentially try to really get to the right decision. That's my guess. Now, if that is interpreted that, oh, he's ordering a CRL, which doesn't sound like it's going to play out that way, uh, uh, I would imagine it's based on, he believes the group that thinks that it should get a CRL. I would be, it'd be hard pressed to believe that he's unilaterally looking at the IND or the NDA and then realizing that, oh yeah, I would definitely give this a CRL. He's listening to people internally, and I can tell you just from my Sarepta experience, internal debates at the FDA are alive and well.
Of course.
And that's my interpretation on it, is, who's he listening to? Who is he believing? What does the data tell him in terms of who's true? That's what I kind of read through, in between the lines on what was communicated.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yep. All right, let's move on to some data. We got a lot of news over the last couple of weeks. ADA was kind of the big medical meeting this week. Sam, do you want to kick off? We've talked a lot about it, diabetes and obesity, and this is a big conference. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Just the first thing I'd like to say is whether we should be still calling it ADA rather than AOA, American Obesity Association. But of course,
Yes.
these two diseases are metabolic diseases and related. But let me just set the context here. There's this loggerhead between Lilly and Novo. Novo's just as an illustration, Novo's added it has gone from 230,000 prescriptions for Wegovy at the beginning of the year to 246,000, 16,000 increase. Zepbound's gone from 160,000 to 366,000. Sorry, to total, right? So we're dealing with with 160,000 increase for Zepbound, 16,000 increase for Wegovy. And Zepbound is now, as I said, 366,000 total versus 246 total. So we have this competition going on, and Zepbound and Lilly are winning it. And I have to say that I think data that came out over the last weekend gives Lilly the upper hand in terms of of what we've seen. So I'm going to try and summarize as fast as I can here. Novo came out with some CagriSema data, and what were we looking for new in there? We knew already that the efficacy was 22.7%, whereas they had suggested 25% previously, but that's already been covered. We've been through that. What was interesting in the detail is that for CagriSema, the weight loss was not as favorable in terms of how much fat you're losing versus muscle. Whereas it was even not as good as Zepbound. So these are the details we were thinking about. So you remember here we have an amylin analog and a GLP-1 semaglutide. So the idea has been that by adding an amylin, you might not only just manage some of the side effect better, but you might also push the weight loss towards more fat versus muscle. And that didn't turn out to be the case. In fact, it turned out to be worse than what we've seen for Zepbound, but this wasn't a head-to-head. So this was the key data set as far as we're concerned for CagriSema. And now there is, of course, a head-to-head trial versus Zepbound redefined for, and that's due to read out sometime in 2026. Sticking with Novo and exactly the same mechanism, GLP-1 plus amylin, but in one molecule, as opposed to two molecules being delivered for CagriSema. So that's amycretin, and that's moving directly into phase 3. But we have questions on the dosing that still continue to be essentially unanswered as far as we're concerned. 24% placebo-adjusted weight loss, so that wasn't bad. That's pretty good at 36 weeks, right? Remember, we're trying to touch that 25% boundary. At least that's what some people have been focused on. And so notice response, 20 milligrams versus 60 milligrams, and overlapping curves at the lower doses. So some questions there where the shorter durations were tested. But the rates of gastrointestinal side effects for amycretin were high. I mean, high. And they need to really be viewed in the context of a phase 1, of course. But we hope that they can get the dosing, etc., in a place that they can manage that. There were a few other things, heart rate increases that were seen beyond what's been seen for Zepbound and Wegovy. And so there's still questions on this combination too. And when I add all this up, and then we look at what Lilly reported, which was their first details of their orforglipron, which is their oral drug, which seemed manageable safety, good tolerability, decent efficacy, even some benefits on the cardiometabolic metrics. I think you'd have to agree to give this conference to Lilly. There's no question that there's such a big market here that Novo can continue to have a significant share and continue to be a big player and have growth there. But they do have something to deal with, and that's in their competitive pipeline. And then, of course, we've had some other things. So Maritide from Amgen reported some details. The tolerability concerns continue to eclipse the weight loss data. Remember, this is an antibody, which tries to be an antagonist of the GIP receptor and an agonist of GLP-1, just like all other GLP-1 agonists. So this is slightly different to what tirzepatide from Lilly is doing, which is an agonist of both. And the data was, compelling weight loss, but we've got that issue with safety and some questions about the way the trial was designed. KOLs questioned it, etc. So there's more work to be done here. And then I'll move on quickly to Metsera's GLP-1. Remember, Metsera's share price has been doing relatively well on the back of this. Well tolerated. It's called MET-097I. It's a GLP-1 in a phase 2A obesity trial. And it achieved weight loss that, in our eyes, rival Lilly's retatrutide. Is titration free, and possibly monthly dosing could provide a differentiation, obviously. So we just have to wait and see whether they can repeat that in phase 2B, and we have the data for that coming over the next year or so. So the drug is a while away from the market in 2028, but it's got a fighting chance, especially given its dosing regime. Of course, the next one is bimagrutide, but I think we're going to try and cover that with Tess.
Yeah. So, well, first, I like your comment about Novo. It's not out of the game at all, right? Even though Lilly is prevailing across these products. And so really great tour de force there on a lot of the data coming out of ADA. And Tess, you want to highlight Lilly's bimagrumab?
Yeah, absolutely. So bimagrumab, so this is a myostatin activin drug that Lilly has been developing. They acquired it from Versana. And what this addresses, so there's been questions with the GLP-1s where, hey, you lose a lot of weight, isn't that great? You also lose a lot of muscle. And are there issues with losing a lot of muscle? And I think that's an unanswered question. I think many who are bullish on some of these muscle agents were, I think, hoping for the FDA to maybe be a little bit more, positive about this as an unmet need in their obesity guidance that came out. But the FDA in their guidance was really, saying that at this point in time there isn't anything that indicates that it's an issue. But we don't know, right? And it may be that particularly in certain patient populations, who are taking GLP-1s, if it's a frail patient population or otherwise, there may be greater concerns about muscle loss. And so bimagrumab is really looking to address some of those concerns. And it was I think pretty interesting, pretty interesting data. And so what they presented is they presented both 48 and 74-week data on bimagrumab, and they showed at the highest dose, which was 30 mg per kg, they showed pretty high weight loss at 48 weeks. So around I think 7% if you just looked at completers, or more like 5% if placebo adjusted. If you looked at those, if you looked at everything on an ITT basis, and that indeed strengthened over time as you got to the later time point. So in addition to that, what they showed is that in combination, you really saw a much higher proportion of fat mass. So, for the semaglutide, this was actually a trial that was semaglutide plus bimagrumab, since it was one that Versana started before Lilly acquired the asset. Lilly is now running these trials with tirzepatide. But in the sema monotherapy arm, about 70% or so of the weight loss was due to fat mass. But then when you got to the combo of bimagrumab and sema, it was over 90%. So that was pretty interesting. Now, what I think is important to note is on the safety and tolerability side of things, there were some side effects that looked not particularly pleasant. So there was a pretty high rate of muscle spasms. There was also pretty high acne. But when this was being discussed, the discussants highlighted that these AEs actually seemed fairly manageable. They didn't see a whole lot of discontinuations as a result of this. And also the way that Lilly is studying this is rather than IV, which was this trial, the way that Lilly is studying this in future trials, and ongoing trials with the Zepbound, is they're using sub-Q. So might there actually be a better AE profile if you have a lower Cmax as a result of sub-Q? So I think it was, bottom line, very interesting data that suggested that these, agents certainly do have an impact on, lean mass, and that there is an additive effect of activin on top of myostatin. That's actually consistent with some of the data that we saw from, Regeneron a couple months ago, and just looking at the comparison versus Scholar Rock as well, which came out with their myostatin data, a few weeks ago. All of those are interesting, but we do see this incremental activity from activin, which seems to be important here in getting to the incremental weight loss, as well as lean mass preservation that these agents could provide. The big questions remain: what will the tolerability, profile look like with these, with this different dosing, and also how much does this actually matter to patients, right? Do they need to see, do they see any kind of functional benefit? That's something that we'll need to see over time with other studies, but certainly an interesting start.
Yeah,
Hey,
thanks, Tess.
Chris,
Yeah,
can I just
please,
jump in very
Tim.
quickly? There was a couple of other things I wanted to add for this. One was just what I was a little bit surprised at is that the cardiometabolic markers improving for the combo versus semaglutide alone. So HSCRP, the cardiac inflammation marker, 83% decrease in the combo arm versus 59% on Wegovy alone. Remember, there's Wegovy in the combo. So that to me was quite an interesting one to observe and trying to understand the mechanism and adiponectin improvements, etc. So there's something else going on in there, which is not just fat loss. And the last thing I would say is you are trying to lose weight to look good. I can't imagine any level of acne that would be acceptable to someone like this. So I think we can brush this side effect issue away and muscle spasms away. I don't know if it's going to be as easy as that when it comes to actual commercial use, unless they manage it somehow.
Well, I guess, Sam, it comes down to how do you trade off acne versus a leaner look? So, well, it's certainly a good point, but I think it's interesting, and the kind of aesthetic aspects, may play in a few different ways. So I was wishing that they had some before and after pictures that they could share as part of this presentations, but we didn't. We didn't get to see those.
I'm sure there's some conjoint analysis that can be done of, is a thinner body with acne, right, more attractive than a
Exactly,
larger body
exactly.
without, right? Yeah. So, but what this all speaks to me, and why there's so much activity in this space and continued investment and interest, is that, there's multiple efficacy parameters that a product can win on. You've got safety issues that a product can win on, irregardless of mechanism. You've got combinatorial approaches that are being attempted that could be flanked by a single product, even with multiple, pluripotent, action. So, like, I think people are realizing this is too big of a market to not try to pursue a better or best in class around this with the various mechanisms. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to evolve. Tess, do you want to cover on the hymns? Speaking of Novo, has been a part of this conversation.
Yeah,
Talk to
I
us
think
about what happened with Novo.
continuing on the obesity theme. So, some big announcements, last week from Novo and Hims, where Novo had, made a couple of different agreements actually with a few groups that can help with their direct to consumer sales of Wegovy, and Hims was one of those. And they'd signed this partnership just a few months ago, I think. On the back of that announcement, I think the Hims stock went up, 30% on that day, and kept going a bit from there. And then just a few short months later, it went back down, with Novo essentially saying that they, were no longer going to make Wegovy available on Hims. And they said that was a result of Hims selling illegitimate knockoff versions of Wegovy that put patient safety at risk. So not just ending the collaboration, but really coming out with some strong words on Hims. And I know we have several other members of the group here who have thoughts on this. So Tim, maybe I will turn it over to you. And what was your reaction when you saw this, Tim?
I mean, I thought it was weird that Novo and Hims did the collaboration in the first place. And the reason is that the business model of Hims, and for that matter, many other players in the market, is to sell compounded GLP-1s to consumers directly. And, there's an obvious reason why that works. The price is lower and consumers care about price. And so, the original deal was sort of weird because you can go buy semaglutide directly from Novo from their direct website. And Hims was literally just selling it for $100 extra per month. And so it's just like a very odd deal in the first place. And I'm not at all surprised that Nova said, like, why are we letting these guys benefit from an affiliation with us when they're essentially selling something that is more or less like a generic version of semaglutide in the market. So not surprising. I mean, for what it's worth, this direct-to-consumer movement with obesity drugs has just gotten very big. Tess and I attended this Royalty Pharma conference, and the CEO of Eli Lilly spoke, and he said that like sales off of the Lilly Direct website are much larger than one might, at least much larger than I would have expected. So just really interesting. I know it's controversial, this area, but personally, I think it's frankly probably good for consumers that they can access these drugs at a price that they can afford.
Great. All right. Well, any other final comments on the obesity theme here and coming out of ADA, Sam, Daphne, before we move on to some other data?
Yeah, I'll comment. I think that the direct to consumer aspect is really interesting and probably positive. And I don't have a problem with compounding per se or selling compounded GLP-1s, especially during a shortage. But I just find HIMSS to be so hypocritical. They present themselves as champions of accessible, science-backed healthcare, criticizing the industry for maximizing profit while profiting themselves. They're basically like a parasite, feeding off of innovation and development that Novo and Lilly did. And then they're pushing these unregulated compounded drugs and kind of circumventing IP protection through regulatory loopholes. And in particular, what was annoying was their advertisements were pushing really hard and slamming the industry, saying that the industry is designed to keep us sick and stuck and it offers one size fits all solutions, it obscures the truth, and it has inflated prices and wants to keep us overweight, and then they basically sell a me too version of the same drugs developed by those companies. So I think it's good that Novo cut ties with them, and I just think they're a shady company overall.
Yep. Yep. Tess, as you know well, Peter Koczynski likes to call them rent seekers as opposed to innovators in our industry, and that's a polite term. Uh,
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I want to move to some data. And Tess, before we go to the Sadara, I want to just highlight, my last interview I announced on Biotech Venture Voices is Glenn Rockman, and he's one of the only VCs that actually still is focused exclusively on antivirals, vaccines, right? Infectious disease, neglected disease around the world. So that interview comes out on Monday. But we mentioned Sadara and lenacapavir on HIV, in their data, to prevent HIV with 2 injections. But Sadara is over $1 billion market cap, and just shows that the universal flu vaccine still has a play here in the market. So you want to cover that one to kick us off on other data?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I think encouraging to see, and an important reminder that we would still like drugs that help us from getting sick. Isn't that, isn't that important? So Sadara is a company, I think just highlighting what happened this week. So on the 23rd, Sadara announced data showing that their flu prevention treatment reduced the risk of flu by as much as 76% at the highest dose in healthy, unvaccinated adults. And so the stock was certainly up on this data. The stock went from kind of low 20s to trading now in the mid to high 40s. I think what this is pretty unprecedented from an efficacy standpoint, and maybe just a little bit of background on Sadara, because this is one that RA's been close to for a while. Is Sadara had actually outlicensed this program to J&J many years ago, we and some others had followed this asset at J&J, and we actually had the opportunity to in-license the asset after J&J had deprioritized infectious disease. And so RA led the financing for Sadara to reacquire the drug back from J&J in April 2024. And my colleague Laura Tadvalkar led that transaction and was on the board, now transitioned over to my colleague Josh. And really just exciting to see after this, long, kind of very biotech process of, out licensing and, bringing things back, seeing data, play out in a way that was, that was really encouraging. And maybe just highlighting a few reasons why we thought this asset was interesting in the first place was, number one, the opportunity for universal protection, right, versus the kind of flu variants that that you see where a vaccine is really designed for some of those flu variants. Two is, the drug was really designed for season long protection. And then three is that you're not relying on an immune response with the mechanism that Cidara uses. And so that's really cool because it's not just the potential to have, efficacy on a, standalone basis, but hey, something that could also be used, potentially on top of a vaccine. So encouraging to see that, even in a market environment where there is a lot of skepticism, and many investors have, really as a result of the regulatory environment, are not doing a whole lot in the vaccine space. Hey, we still have flu, we still have infectious disease, and it's important to have medicines that can, help people
Yep.
from acquiring these diseases.
Yep. And the market reacted, with over 100% return. Congratulations to RA for that investment. And just a shout out, the CEO is a well-known, experienced executive in the infectious disease space, Jeff Stein. Brad Lonkar posted a video of an interview with him from May on Biotech TV. So yeah, great to see an antiviral get that type of attention. Paul, let's move to Compass, and hallucinogenic or psychedelic space has been kind of hotly debated. Phase 3 data from Compass. You want to cover that?
Yeah, sounds good. Positive data that was not well received by the market, and a debate going forward, as you're alluding to. So Compass announced phase 3 data from their first trial of COMP360 psilocybin for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. This was a placebo-controlled study, and to some degree, it was widely expected to succeed for a few reasons. One, I think at this point we kind of know that psychedelics are efficacious. And two, while depression studies are high risk, right, and we've seen drugs like Prozac fail in half their trials, I mean, the psychedelic data has been somewhat more consistent so far. And, there's this kind of debate as to what degree is that due to the drug class, or is that due to, some tailwind from functional unblinding. The stock traded off a lot, I think something like 40%. And, the question is why, and how much of that is the data, and how much of that is actually the sort of small microcap biotech market and certain nuances. I think on the data, the interesting debate here was that the effect size was just not as big as people expected. It was a 3.6 point difference on the MADRS. We've seen other psychedelic trials like Compass's prior trial, or, the GH study, or MindMed in an anxiety population with comorbid depression, show bigger effect sizes in this, in some cases much bigger. I think our view is like, it's really hard to compare across these studies because of the time point differences. Compass was 6 weeks. I mean, the GH data looks incredible with their effect size, but that was only at 1 week. MindMed's a different population. It's not treatment-resistant depression. And I guess our other sort of perspective here is, if you just take 1,000-foot view, while psychedelics are certainly a new class and maybe more cumbersome to use, you could argue the clinical bar is higher. The converse to that is, at least in the psychiatry space, I've long been of the view that investors grossly overrate efficacy and effect sizes on these scales that are really subjective, and at the end of the day just don't seem to be driving prescribing decisions. And, I guess case in point, if you're and optimistic on the Compass data or some of these next-gen psychedelics, which I am, Spravato from J&J is probably going to sell around $1.5 billion this year, and the drug failed in half its studies, and its average effect size is less than what we've seen from Compass's average effect size. So, I still feel like this is a real space, and again, I feel like investors often treat psychiatry like it's oncology. These scales are hand wavy. There's so many reasons why one trial might look one way versus another. And, I would just say that, the KOLs are often not really in the weeds in what the effect size is for a given drug, or how many failed trials that drug might even have that aren't published or on the drug's label. I think the other sort of practical issue here, and I'd be curious to hear anyone else's view, like Tess or Tim or Daphne, but like just as it relates to kind of stock setups and sentiment in the market, I think one thing that it was challenging for Compass on these data, and we'll never be able to run a controlled study and see how it would have traded if the data showed a bigger effect. But I think one thing that was challenged is there's this little bit of a sell the news dynamic with some of these little companies that head into a catalyst vacuum. The next phase 3 doesn't read out until second half of next year. Right or wrong, there's a perception that these psychedelics companies are lower probability M&A targets because they're just so unique, right? And a conservative pharma might not be as inclined to buy a psychedelic like they might be inclined to buy Karuna, right? And I don't know if that's true, but that's the perception. I mean, it's probably true in some cases. And so I think that's like part of this as well. And it's a little bit of a cautionary tale of just, are we in a good market? Are we not in a good market? I mean, I feel like there is more risk on in small cap biotech right now, but I also think you have to be conscientious when you're thinking about how stocks trade in these events on the exact setup. What comes after it? Does the next investor feel like they have to own the stock after the data? Timelines, things like that. Again, and I ultimately our perspective is you really can't. You have to have investment ratings that are based on fundamentals, not based on these kind of month by month stock setup things. But the market's the market, and this is kind of how this played out.
Yep. I'll just also add that, obviously, RFK Jr. has been vocal about this being an area that he wants to see kind of more attention and focus. And I believe the deputy CEDAR director has kind of lineage in the psychedelic space and is perceived as a positive. So I do think, and Daphne is as well, in the CNS space, in the neuropsych area, it's still the bastion of personalized, like where you're looking across at that patient, and like if something's not working, they're going to try something else. But if it's an armamentarium driven kind of disease space. So it'll be interesting to watch that. But we've got a lot of data to cover still, so we'll try to rapid fire through this. Tim, Nectar's been the roller coaster company, ups and downs over the years. What's the latest that they're back in the news?
Yep. So Nektar had data readout this week on a program that was returned from Eli Lilly. The program ResPEG had a huge phase 2b win this week in atopic dermatitis. The drug works kind of sort of uniquely through an IL-2 Treg stimulation mechanism. And boy, did they make their point, which is, Tregs really matter in this particular disease. The effect size was very substantial, and I think all of us sort of looking at the situation thinks that Dupixent may have a new competitor. Now, Dupixent's doing over $10 billion a year, and by the end of the week, Nektar stock was up like 200%, but like you wonder if maybe the company's worth even more still.
Excellent. So the other news that came out in the last 2 weeks was out of Sarepta and a second death, and they really saw their stock drop precipitously. And just to put this in perspective, a year ago in June, they hit, which was their almost 5-year high. They hit over $170 in 2020, but they almost hit $170 a year ago in June of 2024. And today they're trading in the $17.40 range. So again, this is a company that's expected to do over 2 billion this year. The FDA has said they're going to look closely at this. There's been a stopping of shipments to the non-ambulatory population because both deaths occurred in the non-ambulatory, and so people were worried another shoe would drop, and so I think Sarepta is being closely paid attention to. And then they still have over $1 billion in the oligonucleotide business, which doesn't have the safety risks, but there is a lot of competition coming out of Avidity, Dyne, others that are gunning for better, kind of oligo sequence targeting for RNA technologies. So, with that, any comments, Sam, on this Elevidys gene therapy from Sarepta? What's your take on it?
Well, first, of course, the second tragedy, and you hope that you never ever see this happen with any drug. So and it's being prescribed to the non-ambulatory group, which is just I'll make the connection to the FDA. So this is the indication that Peter Marks did a lot of good things at the FDA, but this is one that he perhaps might be remembered for in the end, that he
And
overrode.
I'll just add, Vinay was very vocal
That's
via
right.
his podcast of that particular decision. Yep.
Yeah. So he overruled the reviewers and pushed it for all patients, which includes these non-ambulatory group. And that is what I think is the one thing that everyone's going to remember here and point to, and like we're doing, right? So I just wonder whether this will at all impact the newfound regulatory flexibility that they're talking about with regards to cell and gene therapies, or at least the very hyper orphan diseases, ultra orphan diseases. I hope not, because this is partly the agency's fault themselves. Over.
Yep. And look, and related to DMD and controversial data sets, if you will, arguments on both sides for Capricor, where it seems like the FDA wants to take a closer look, but canceled an AdCom, right? So I think there's mixed feelings on whether this is a positive move versus a negative. The company put out a press release stating that they just released even more data, stronger data supporting a potential approval. So again, you can kind of draw a line through the DMD experiences of controversial data sets and how the FDA is interpreting it. But any further comments on kind of the Capricor, Paul? Since I know you've spoken about this in the past.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just kind of mentioning with the earlier stuff with Macquarie and Calvista and whatever that the reporting here was that Capricor that the AdCom may have been canceled because Dr. Prasad has reservations about that therapy and doesn't want an AdCom, and that might have been part of how Nicole Verdun may have been let go. Also, there are other potential reasons that were talked about by Stat News on why she may have been let go related to styles. And I actually think, the Nicole Verdun departure is at face unfortunate for the gene therapy space. I mean, I've heard from a number of companies in this area that saw her as a really good regulator and partner. On the other hand, Chris, like you were saying, right, when you have new leadership in an organization, like things like this are going to happen and they're not shocking. Like I think of companies of mine, right, where a CEO or CFO has changed. I mean, you often see, if the company's not acquired in the next year, you often see half the C-suite also turnover, right, as people bring in their own people or people they have better chemistry with. I think as it relates to Capricor, like this is one of the decisions that investors are looking to as a barometer of FDA flexibility, right? I mean, we've heard Prasad and Macquarie say, quote unquote, all the right things in rare disease and talk about, approving something on mechanism or small studies or things like that. And so this Capricor product, right, it's something that has natural history controlled data over time. That's the crux of the efficacy argument. I think the cancellation of the AdCom is probably because of the reporting and because of some of the context seen is probably more negative, but I don't cover the stock, but it's something we're watching as we think about other sort of regulatory stuff in gene therapy, like Unicure. And this isn't gene therapy, but in the space, like Unicure, for example.
Great. All right, we're approaching the hour. I'm going to ask for some. So first, there have been a lot of activities with the ACIP, removal and adding in the first meeting where they basically announced they want to take their Marisol out of the flu vaccine. New Cedar Head. We don't have time to cover all of that. Sam, I know you would want to comment on that. We got two more items I want to cover. Sam on Illumina, SomaLogic, and then Tim, we're going to go to you on the Bayer Blue Rock news before we wrap. Sam,
Yeah,
quick
sure.
on Illumina.
Yeah, what's interesting here is that this company was acquired for about $50 million about a year ago. So SomaLogic was a public company, and then now, of course, Illumina is buying them. So this is just testament to the increasing importance of multiomics, if you like. So the demand for that application is on the rise. Illumina is paying $350 million. I'm doing it really fast, so I hope I don't get the numbers wrong.
Yep.
And there's a handful of smaller deals that have happened here, and these guys had a partnership before. So it's testament to the importance and breadth of what these companies are offering now for research, and soon moving into the more mainstream.
Yeah, and Illumina, I mean, to their credit, protecting their business and realizing that the the needs and technologies are moving fast, and they need to be ahead of the curve on this. Tim, Bear Blue Rock, this is one of those where I just see it as a cautionary tale when you think your programs are going to move forward with a large pharma, but Bear's had issues. You want to comment on what's going on there? Tim, if you heard that, Bear and Blue Rock.
Sorry, I was saying Bayer bought Blue Rock a couple years ago with a focus on treating Parkinson's with a very innovative cell therapy program. Bayer shut down the Blue Rock R&D lab last week with the effect of essentially letting go about 50 people. To be clear, they didn't stop the phase 3 trial for their Parkinson's drug. What's exciting and I think very interesting is that there's a number of other players in this space, companies like Kenai, that look really good. And, we are seeing lots of talk of significantly better data coming out of some of the other companies in Parkinson's. So this is going to be a big space to watch, I think, over the next year or so as we start to see the data sets emerge from some of these challengers to Blue Rock, which is the first generation Parkinson's cell therapy company.
Yeah, and just want to shout out lastly the Revolution Medicines and Royalty Pharma. I think maybe timed with Royalty Pharma's meeting to announce this $2 billion deal, creative structure, part royalty, part debt deal for their RAS inhibitor pipeline. Tess or Sam, any comments on that? Tess, I think you were at the conference. I don't know if they talked a lot about that to wrap the final news of the week.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Very positive note on which to wrap up, wrap things up. So Royalty Pharma announced a $2 billion investment in in Revolution Medicines. That was really a deal. Obviously, Royalty Pharma is not an equity investor, but they're really taking a bet on Revolution Medicines having a leading drug and leading franchise. Um, and I had an opportunity at the conference that Tim and I both attended to speak with the CFO, and he shared their thesis on really wanting to support biotech companies and staying independent, and staying independent and being able to create value longer, which is obviously fantastic to have more groups that are really focused on doing that and enabling that. I thought what was also really encouraging was just, I think the stock reaction, was fairly neutral, I want to say, to the deal. Just looking that up now, but that's always encouraging that you don't have this oh, everyone's just kind of sitting around hoping for a buyout, right? So
Yep.
kudos to the RevMed team for working with Royalty Pharma for what sounds like a really impactful deal.
Excellent. Daphne, just to go to you for any final comments before we wrap.
Yeah, no, I think that generally the thing that seemed to be the most concerning is the lack of capital for a lot of companies. One note on the Royalty Pharma conference, which I thought was pretty interesting, since we're talking a lot about Lilly, was Dave Ricks, Lilly CEO, mentioned that they're looking to get back into neuropsych. They had some big mega blockbusters with Prozac, Cymbalta, and Zyprexa, and they said they're waiting for the right opportunity to get back in. And then one last note is that Rajiv Kaul mentioned about how the market cap of NVIDIA is, it's actually greater than the top 10 pharma companies combined, and all of the market cap growth across big pharma has been driven by Lilly.
Great.
So,
So we
yeah.
might see a Seaport Lilly deal in the future at some point. Who knows?
Yeah, no,
All
no
right.
promises.
Well,
Yeah.
well, thank you all for tuning in this week to Biotech Hangout, and we'll see you at the next one. That's a wrap.